Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I've been searching for a used car for weeks, but was struggling to find anything in my price range that wasn't extremely high mileage or visibly falling apart. My old clunker had finally died for good, and I needed transportation for my commute to work. One night, while browsing Craigslist, I came across a listing for a 2008 Honda Accord being sold for an unbelievable price, only $4,500. That was easily several $1,000s cheaper than similar Accord models from that year. The ad said the Honda had only 85,000 miles on it and was in perfect mechanical condition. It had a clean title and passed smog recently. The seller was a man named Todd who claimed he was able to sell a car so cheap because he fixed up auction vehicles at the auto shop he owned. I was immediately skeptical of the low price for such a decently modern car, but the ad seemed convincing enough. I exchanged a few emails with Todd, and he maintained the Accord was in great shape and the price was accurate. He said he just needed cash quick for a new business investment. We arranged for me to come inspect the car at his shop that weekend. When Saturday arrived, I drove 30 minutes out of town to the mechanic's garage Todd had given me the address for. It was in an industrial area with a lot of auto body shops and salvagers around. I was hesitant pulling into such a seemingly shady area, but figured it was normal for a mechanic's shop. Todd greeted me outside when I pulled up. He was a large, imposing man with grease-stained clothes, but he seemed friendly enough and eager to show me the Honda. The shop's lot was full of used cars, which Todd said were waiting to be tinkered on before selling. The blue Accord was parked right out front. At initial glance, it looked clean aside from a few minor scratches on bumpers. Todd handed me the keys and I sat inside while he hovered nearby. The interior was worn but intact, with 122 miles on the odometer now instead of the 85 advertised. Todd claimed he had just driven it back from an auction out of state. We took the car for a brief test drive, and it handled smoothly with no noticeable issues. The engine sounded quiet, the brakes worked fine, and the ride felt solid. Todd assured me this was one of the best cars he had flipped in a while. My uneasiness grew as I inspected the Accord closer. The gap between advertised and actual miles was concerning, as were a few patched spots and loose trim pieces I noticed. But foolishly, I ignored my gut instinct in favor of landing the steal of a deal. The car seemed drivable enough, and I needed wheels ASA. We settled on a final price of $4,000, which I paid Todd in cash on the spot before driving off excitedly in the Accord. That excitement faded fast. The very next day, the check engine light flashed on, and the car started making a strange grinding noise. I popped the hood to find power steering fluid leaking everywhere. Cautiously, I kept driving it to work during the week, but the engine seemed to get louder and sloppier with each trip. Less than a week later, as I was driving to dinner, the brakes failed suddenly and completely. I pumped them rapidly with no response before just narrowly avoiding rear-ending someone thanks to the emergency brake. I had it towed home, and my mechanic confirmed the entire brake system would need replaced. On top of that, the engine had a cracked block from overheating that meant the motor was toast. Shell-shocked, I called Todd immediately to demand my money back, but the number he had given me was now disconnected. I drove back out to his shop, but the lot was completely empty besides some oil spots. The whole business had packed up and left. It dawned on me then that Todd had intentionally scammed me by selling a junker he fixed up just enough to appear operable before making off with my money. I did some digging online and found others across the state who had been similarly tricked by Todd and his ruse mechanic shop. He would buy total vehicles from salvage auctions, hastily repair them, and pawn them off to unsuspecting buyers answering his Craigslist ads. By the time the cars broke down, Todd was long gone. Furious and distressed, I tried weighing my options. I couldn't afford to repair or replace the Honda now. The DMV said it wasn't even legal to drive in its current state with brake failure. All I could do was pay to junk it for parts and try recouping some money that way. Before I could even process getting scammed, things got much worse. One morning there was a loud bang on my front door around 6 a.m. I opened it bleary-eyed to two police officers who asked if I owned a blue 2008 Honda Accord. I confirmed I did, and they informed me the car had been involved in a hit-and-run accident the previous month before I bought it. The victim had gotten the plate number and given it to police. Since the car was now registered under my name, I was being implicated as the prime suspect in the hit-and-run case. The officers said they had already confirmed the dates didn't line up with my ownership, but had to follow protocol by questioning me. A deep pit formed in my stomach, realizing not only did I buy a useless lemon, but it had been part of a crime I now had to prove my innocence in. I told the police the full story of buying the car from Todd's ad without knowing his history. But with Todd long vanished and the trail gone cold, this nightmare was now my reality. The Accord sat useless in my driveway as a constant reminder. The police were hassling me for statements and alibis. My registration and insurance were revoked. My finances were drained from repairs and legal fees. All because I had ignored blaring warning signs and hastily purchased a too-good-to-be-true car from some disreputable Craigslist scammer. This experience taught me important lessons about properly vetting used car purchases and trusting my gut instincts instead of jumping at a deal that seems suspiciously discounted. That moment of gullibility has now left me fighting accusations for crimes I wasn't involved in and dealing with the ramifications of buying an illegal junker of a car. I won't be answering any more sketchy online auto ads anytime soon after the financial and legal pit this one has left me in. What seems too good to be true, it always is. I was in desperate need of a new phone recently after my old one finally died after years of faithful use. Money has been really tight for me lately, so I decided to browse Craigslist to see if I could find a decent used phone for cheap. I'm always hesitant about meeting strangers from the internet, but I was in a bind and figured I could take some simple precautions. After scrolling through listings for a while, I came across an ad for an iPhone 11 being sold for only $100. The ad was sparse on details, simply stating the phone was in good condition and an ultra-low price was because the seller needed to get rid of it ASAP. That set off some alarm bells in my head, but $100 was an absolute steal compared to buying a new phone at full retail price, so I decided to at least inquire about it. I contacted the seller through the anonymous Craigslist email relay and asked for more specifics on the phone's condition and why they were selling it so cheap. They wrote back saying it was fully functional, barely used, but they urgently needed cash due to personal issues. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them that evening to check out the phone in person. Before heading out, I made sure to tell my roommate Tina where I was going, who I was meeting, and showed her the seller's profile. I gave her the address of the coffee shop downtown where we agreed to meet and told her to call the police if she didn't hear back from me by 10 p.m. For protection, I also grabbed a canister of pepper spray and discreetly placed it in my purse. You can never be too careful meeting strangers. When I arrived at the bustling coffee shop, I immediately spotted who I assumed was the seller sitting alone at a table with a phone box placed in front of them. They matched the generic description from their ad and appeared harmless at first glance. Just a regular guy probably in his mid to late 20s. We exchanged awkward pleasantries and I sat down to inspect the phone. It was indeed an iPhone 11 in seemingly flawless condition. I asked why he was selling such a nice device so cheap. The seller mumbled something about urgent bills to pay and needing fast cash, all while avoiding eye contact. He seemed incredibly antsy, his eyes darting around like he wanted to bolt at any second. In hindsight, I probably should have picked up on those red flags, but I was so enthralled by the prospect of scoring an iPhone 11 for $100 that I ignored my instincts. Eagerly, I paid him the cash and off he went, disappearing into the evening crowd before I could even say goodbye. I decided to grab a coffee and settle in to start setting up the phone. As soon as it powered on, I noticed there was no passcode lock set up, which was unusual for a used device. Once it finished booting, I began going through it and saw there were no contacts, photos, emails, apps, or any other personal content you would expect to find on someone's old phone. All the settings and accounts had been completely wiped clean. Things started to feel eerie when I opened the web browser and saw an old news article still pulled up about a notorious local serial killer who had recently died during a police shootout. This man had terrorized our town for months, kidnapping and brutally murdering at least half a dozen people before finally being caught. I felt a chill down my spine as I started to wonder who this phone might have belonged to originally. I searched the device's serial number online and found a recent news story mentioning how the deceased killer used to taunt authorities by sending gruesome photos of his victims from burner phones before destroying them. The serial number matched one of the phones described. My heart sank as I realized this must have been one of that murderer's old devices. No wonder the sketchy seller practically threw it at me and vanished. Panic flooded my mind as I thought about all the vile things that could potentially be recovered from this phone if forensics experts dug deeper into it. And now it was in my possession, even if only briefly. What if the serial killer had some kind of tracking app installed to monitor the phone's location? What if he had a secret camera or microphone? I felt exposed and corrupted just having it near me. In a frenzy, I immediately backed up nothing and factory reset the phone down to its bones. But I was still paranoid, so as soon as I got home I reset it again manually, scrubbing every last byte clean. I didn't even want to keep this tainted device any longer, so the next day I had literally smashed it to pieces with a hammer and dumped the shards in various trash cans around my neighborhood. I know realistically the odds are low that anything could come back to me, but I'm still haunted by the what-ifs. My personal info and address got entered into the phone that first night when I started setting it up. What if the serial killer somehow had tracking software or hidden cameras buried deep in the device's firmware? What if the police somehow recover files from it and trace it back to me? I deeply regret not just spending the extra money to buy a new phone through proper channels instead of tempting fate and my safety trying to save a measly $100 on Craigslist. You really have no idea who you're dealing with on there or the potentially dark history behind the items being sold. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. So in summary, that's the twisted story of how I unknowingly and briefly acquired the former phone of an infamous serial killer before frantically purging any trace of it from my life. I should have trusted my instincts and been way more cautious about meeting questionable strangers from the internet for online deals that seemed too good to be true. At least I wiped and destroyed the phone immediately once I realized something wasn't right, so hopefully nothing can tie it back to me now. But I still feel haunted, like I'm going to somehow get sucked into this horror story just by having been the next unsuspecting owner, even if only for a day. Let my experience serve as a warning to others that some bargains aren't worth the risk, no matter how appealing. When it comes to Craigslist, you never know the potentially dark history behind that cheap used stuff. I'll be sticking to only well-reviewed major retailers from now on. Lesson learned. When my husband and I bought our first house last year, we were over the moon. After years of cramped apartments, we finally had a place of our own to decorate however we wanted. We daydreamed about turning the empty rooms into a cozy home filled with beautiful furniture and decorative touches. Our budget was tight as first-time homeowners, so we turned to Craigslist to hunt for deals. One Saturday morning, an ad posted just an hour before it caught my eye. A full living room set, a vintage dark wood couch, love seat, armchair, and coffee table was being sold for only $500 by an elderly couple downsizing to a smaller home. The photos showed an elegant and antique-looking set, just the style we loved. I eagerly emailed the sellers, and they responded right away asking us to come take a look that same day. They seemed anxious to get rid of the furniture quickly. With excitement building, we rented a U-Haul and plugged the address into the GPS. The home's about 45 minutes outside of town, down winding back roads. As we pulled up the long dirt driveway, my anticipation turned to unease. The property was unkempt with knee-high weeds and peeling paint. I had imagined a quaint country cottage, but this home looked decrepit, almost abandoned. An elderly man opened the crooked front door after we knocked several times. He looked startled to see us there, even though we were expected. As he silently led us inside, I noticed his pale skin and the faraway look in his cloudy eyes. The living room was dim with all the curtains drawn, but I could see the set did look just like the photos. Intricately carved wood with a rich mahogany finish. It seemed out of place in the dilapidated, soiled interior. My husband counted out $500 cash as I stood anxiously waiting to leave. This place gave me the creeps. The old man shuffled around slowly as he helped to load the heavy furniture into our truck. He wheezed with the effort, but never spoke a single word. I felt relieved when we were finally driving away from that rundown house, though I still had an unsettled pit in my stomach about the eerie encounter. At home, my husband and I excitedly arranged the vintage furniture in our living room. It looked gorgeous and just as we'd imagined. That night, however, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing odd noises, the sound of creaking floorboards and groaning walls. My husband slept soundly beside me. Over the next few nights, the noises continued even though my husband never heard them. Exhausted from lack of sleep, I started having unsettling, vivid nightmares. I dreamed I was back at the elderly couple's dilapidated house, wandering room to room in the dark. In the dreams, I could hear their hushed voices whispering all around me, though I never saw their faces. The air felt heavy and oppressive, like the house itself was watching me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. Soon I began feeling uncomfortable and on edge in our own living room. I dreaded going in there alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched and would see shadowy movements out of the corner of my eye. A couple times, I thought I saw the armchair move slightly when no one was near it. My husband assumed I was just anxious about our new home and blew off my concerns. But one sunny afternoon about a month after buying the set, I was vacuuming the living room when I heard a loud scraping noise. I turned to see the heavy wood coffee table sliding several feet across the floor until it stopped directly in front of me. I stood there frozen, the vacuum still roaring, pulse pounding in my ears. I knew then something was very wrong with this furniture. That night, I tearfully begged my husband that we had to get rid of it immediately. Even though I couldn't explain rationally what was happening, I truly felt an evil presence attached to those antiques. He was reluctant given how much we'd spent, but finally agreed I seemed genuinely frightened. We donated it to a local thrift shop the very next day. The second that furniture left our home, I felt the heavy, ominous weight that had been pressing down on us lift. The noises and nightmares ceased completely and I once again slept peacefully. My husband never experienced anything strange personally, but chalked it up to my imagination being overactive in our new home. But I'd known my core those antiques carried sinister energy. I'll never buy secondhand furniture again without learning its full history, and I advise others to be very cautious antique hunting. Some things are better left in the past where they belong. For me, that $500 Craigslist deal wasn't worth the terror I felt in my own home, and I'm just grateful nothing tragic occurred. I can't explain it rationally, yet I have no doubt that a malevolent force had attached itself to those antiques over the years, and it did not intend to leave our home without a fight. I was in a tight spot when my lease was ending and I still hadn't found a new apartment. Rents in the city had skyrocketed, and everything in my price range got snatched up almost immediately. I was starting to panic as my move-out date got closer. I'd spent weeks scouring all the rental sites, calling up every listing that fit my budget, even driving around different neighborhoods looking for rent signs. But it was no use. The units were either already leased or just plain dumpsters not worth the rent. In a moment of desperation, I turned to Craigslist, figuring I might find a small landlord renting out a unit that wasn't listed on the major sites. I clicked through page after page of apartment postings, carefully filtering out the obvious scams. A ridiculous number of listings claimed to have large luxury apartments available for a fraction of typical rates, clearly bait to lure in unsuspecting renters. I learned to spot the signs of sketchy posts, stock photos of pristine interiors, glowing descriptions riddled with typos, insisting on wire transfers as the only form of payment. After scrolling past pages of these scammy or outdated posts, I finally came across one that looked promising, a recently renovated one-bedroom for only $800 a month. That was on the cheaper side for this trendy neighborhood, where tiny studios were going for double that rate. The photos showed bright, spacious rooms with shining hardwood floors, a sparkling white-tiled bathroom, and a large updated kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. It looked almost too good to be true, especially for the price, but the details convinced me it was legitimate. I emailed the lister right away to ask for more information, not letting myself get too excited in case it didn't pan out. But I was pleasantly surprised when he got back to me surprisingly fast, introducing himself as Eric and providing a long, thoughtful description of the unit's features. He touted the newly refinished hardwood floors, walk-in closet, laundry in the basement, and low maintenance because the owner lived next door. Everything he said matched up with the photos, and he came across as knowledgeable and genuine. When I asked about the low rent for such a nice apartment, Eric had a reasonable explanation. The owner was his elderly uncle who preferred long-term tenant stability over maximizing profits. As a retired school teacher, his uncle wasn't relying on the income and cared more about finding respectable tenants who would live there for years. According to Eric, his uncle was fed up with short-term renters who trashed the place and skipped town. That story resonated with me, and I let myself get excited that I had finally found the perfect apartment after weeks of disappointment. But then Eric mentioned there was a lot of interest in the unit, with over a dozen other applicants wanting to see it. He said if I wanted to take it off the market, I'd need to put down a deposit that evening. This made me pause. I knew I shouldn't hand over money without seeing the place first, but Eric seemed so genuine over email. He assured me the deposit just held the unit until I could come view it in person, and that I'd get it back immediately if I didn't like it. And with my move-out deadline coming up fast, I worried I'd lose this place if I didn't act quickly. Against my better judgment, I agreed and sent over a deposit that same night. Eric confirmed he had received it and said he was excited for me to see the place in a couple days. But then things took a concerning turn. When I emailed the next morning to confirm the exact time to meet, I never heard back. I tried calling and texting him several times over the next few days, but couldn't get through. With my move-out deadline only a week away, I started to panic. I decided to just show up at the address Eric had given, hoping I could talk directly to the owner if Eric was dodging me. But when I arrived at the location, my heart sank. It wasn't an apartment building at all, but a boarded-up old warehouse tagged with graffiti. Trash bags and rotten furniture littered the sidewalk out front. It looked completely abandoned, not at all like the charming neighborhood Eric had described. I felt like an idiot. Here I was, a desperate renter who let a Craigslist scammer prey on my vulnerabilities. Of course, it was too good to be true. An updated, spacious apartment for well below market value. I should have known better. But in my rush to find housing, I ignored all warning signs. Now I was at a hefty deposit and almost out of time to find a new place. I spent days trying every method I could think of to reach Eric and get my money back, but it was useless. His number went straight to a generic voicemail and never returned. My emails bounced back undelivered. I visited the local police station in person to report the scam, but they said Craigslist fraud was common and tough to investigate with little to go on. The sad truth slowly sunk in that my money was gone for good. I was ashamed I could be so gullible and angry at Eric for exploiting those in desperate situations. It left me in an awful position so close to move out with barely any savings left for a new apartment. I dreaded having to crash on friends' couches or pay for an extended hotel stay. In retrospect, there were a number of obvious red flags I should have noticed. The cheap rent way below market rate, the claim that there was high demand sight unseen, the insistence on a deposit before viewing, all clear signs of a typical rental scam. But in my rush to find housing, I ignored my gut feeling. If nothing else, this was a hard lesson to never let desperation overrule caution when something seems too good to be true. I now know to verify listings in person, never send money up front to strangers, and listen to my instincts no matter how convincing someone seems over email. It was an expensive mistake, but one I will never make again. My warning to others apartment hunting is to be extra vigilant about Craigslist scams targeting those in urgent need of housing. Don't let yourself get so desperate that you hand over money without verifying the situation first. In the end, a scam will just make your search harder and leave you with nothing. I had to learn the hard way, but hopefully my bad experience can help others avoid the same fate. Desperation in housing scams can be a dangerous combination, so keep your guard up. Trust your gut feeling and stay safe out there, unlike me. Selling things on Craigslist never seems to go smoothly for me. Most of my ads get little to no response, just a bunch of time wasters sending absurd lowball offers. But I was hopeful when I posted my Canon 5D Mark IV camera package for sale at $2,000. It was a high-end model, barely used, plus extra batteries, lenses, bags, the works. Perfect condition for a great price. To my surprise, I actually got an email from a guy named Matt within a day of listing it. He said he was looking for that exact camera and lens set up for an upcoming work trip. He needed it fast and was willing to pay the asking price in cash without any haggling. I have to admit, I was extremely excited that I wouldn't have to negotiate or deal with the usual Craigslist headache. We arranged to meet that evening in the parking lot of a grocery store to complete the transaction. When I arrived, I saw Matt waiting near a blue set and waving me over. He was average height, medium build, dressed casually, and looked to be in his mid-30s. I remember thinking he seemed totally normal and unsuspicious. As we inspected the camera equipment, he asked thoughtful questions and clearly knew his stuff. This put me at ease. He was a legitimate buyer who would put the gear to good use. Matt counted out 40 crisp $50 bills, the full $2,000 price we had agreed on. I happily handed over the camera, extra lenses, filters, bags, batteries, memory cards, everything he would need. We expressed our gratitude for a smooth sale, and just like that he was on his way. And so was I. At the time, I didn't think to ask for his last name, license plate, or any contact information beyond the basic email exchange. He seemed nice and I didn't expect any issues to arise. Over the next week, I started to spend those bills here and there, using them for groceries, gas, meals out, and other small purchases. To be honest, I was just excited to have some extra cash in my wallet, so I didn't inspect the bills closely or think twice when they were accepted by cashiers. Everything seemed perfectly fine until I went to deposit $500 of the cash into my bank account about 8 days later. The next morning, I received a troubling call from my bank asking me to come to the branch so they could verify the bills. Apparently, the deposit triggered some kind of counterfeit detection alarm. That's when it dawned on me. Matt must have paid me entirely in fake cash. I felt like an idiot for not even considering that possibility. At the bank, they confirmed all the $50s were clearly counterfeit. In fact, it was the same serial number printed on each one, a telltale sign, they explained. The bank legally had to confiscate the bogus cash and said they were required to notify the Secret Service since it involved such a substantial amount of counterfeit money. I was in shock and insisted I had no idea the bills were fake. I genuinely thought I had earned $2,000 fair and square. But without Matt's identity or the ability to track him, I had no way to prove where I got the counterfeit cash. The bank tipped off the Secret Service, who quickly got involved to question me about the fraudulent funds. I provided the Secret Service with all the details I could, the emails Matt and I exchanged, when and where we met, everything I could remember about our interaction. But with only a common first name as a lead, the agents said there wasn't much they could do to find the perpetrator. I felt so foolish for not getting more information from someone I was meeting off Craigslist, especially with such a valuable item. The Secret Service had me file an official report as a victim, but also warned that I could face charges myself if I continued passing the phony money now that I was aware it was fake. I panicked thinking of every cash purchase I had made over the past week when I assumed the money was real. Did I break the law without even realizing it? This realization sent my anxiety through the roof. I now feared I could have the cops show up at my door to arrest me any day if they thought I was intentionally spending bogus cash. I got paranoid about using any bills for fear they could also be counterfeit. My bank account took a major hit from losing $2,000 I thought I had earned. And I no longer had the camera equipment I was trying to sell in the first place, just a worthless pile of fake 50s. I was consumed with frustration at myself for not taking basic precautions during such a high-dollar Craigslist transaction. I should have at least written down Matt's license plate, or met him somewhere more public instead of a random grocery store lot. But hindsight is 20/20. In the moment, nothing seemed off or suspicious at all. For weeks, I was a total nervous wreck, thinking law enforcement would show up at any moment to haul me off for unknowingly spending counterfeit money. I felt violated and betrayed, like my basic faith in fair transactions had been shattered. I stopped using Craigslist entirely out of fear I would get scammed again. The lingering paranoia and anxiety made me hyper-aware of how much fraud happens online under the radar. I'm still not sure if Matt was ever caught and prosecuted. I can only hope the Secret Service tracked him down before he duped anyone else with its homemade funny money operation. As for me, I decided not to let it completely destroy my trust in people. There are still genuinely kind strangers out there, but I certainly learned to be more cautious and skeptical, no matter how safe and innocent a situation appears on the surface. Though this painful ordeal, I gained some street smarts and will never again accept cash payments from online buyers I don't know, no matter the amount. It just opens the door for scams that aren't worth the risk or ensuing stress. Let my misfortune serve as a warning to others selling high-value items. When it seems too good to be true, it very likely is. I never imagined that responding to a simple Craigslist ad would open the door to months of torment. It all started when I decided I wanted to get into better shape. I had struggled with my weight for years and finally committed to making a change. I didn't want to spend a lot of money, so I browsed Craigslist for a used exercise bike. That's when I came across Mark's ad. The bike looked to be in decent condition in the photos. Mark said he was only selling it because he was moving and needed the space. The price, just $50, seemed almost too good to be true. I decided to go for it. Mark and I exchanged a few messages. He came across as friendly and eager to make the sale. We arranged a time for him to bring the bike over to my apartment. When Mark arrived, he was all smiles and chatter, asking about my workout goals and telling me how much I was going to love the bike. He was a little overbearing, but I brushed it off as simple enthusiasm. We got the bike set up in my spare bedroom, and Mark gave me a detailed tutorial on how to use it properly. He offered all sorts of tips on cycling techniques, suggested workout regimens, and kept repeating that I could reach out anytime if I had questions. After about 30 minutes, Mark finally left and I did a quick test ride on the bike. It seemed to work perfectly. Eager to get started on my fitness journey, I hopped on for a longer workout that evening. In those first few weeks, I was on the bike nearly every day, pushing myself but also seeing results. I felt like I had accomplished something great by taking control of my health. That's when I received the first message from Mark, asking how the bike was working out, if I was finding the workouts easy enough. I told him the bike was great and I appreciated him following up. I thought that would be the end of it, but over the next few days, more messages rolled in. Mark asked increasingly personal questions about my exercise regimen, my eating habits, even my moods and stress levels throughout the day. At first, I politely deflected, but the messages kept coming, sometimes as many as 3 or 4 per day, through both texts and Craigslist. Mark fixated on my workout schedule, asking what time I got on the bike each morning, how many miles I went, and if I was mixing up my routines enough. The questions started to make me uneasy. It felt like Mark was monitoring my every move. One Saturday morning, I was halfway through a bike workout when the doorbell rang. I didn't think much of it at first. When I went to answer, there stood Mark on my doorstep. Shocked and confused, I stammered out a greeting. Mark rushed past me into the apartment, saying he just wanted to see the bike in action. He marched toward my spare bedroom, going on about proper settings and posture. I stood frozen in disbelief. I hadn't given Mark my address, nor did I say he could come over. After that incident, the messages from Mark became downright obsessive. He demanded photos of the bike odometer to check my mileage. He called late at night, insisting we discuss my nutritional choices. I stopped responding at all, but that only seemed to agitate him. Mark showed up at my apartment 2 more times, banging on the door and peering in the windows when I wouldn't answer. I considered calling the police, but Mark always fled before they would arrive. I dreaded every buzz on my phone, fearful it would be another intrusive message from Mark. I started having nightmares where I was biking away from some unknown threat, my legs burning and lungs screaming. After a month of harassment from Mark, I was a nervous wreck. I stopped using the bike altogether, hoping it would get Mark to leave me alone. But his texts became increasingly unhinged, vacillating between professing his worry for me and threatening to come check on the bike himself. Late one night as I lay in bed, I heard a faint rattling coming from the spare room. My heart dropped. I tiptoed down the hall and peered through the crack in the door. There sat Mark, pedaling away furiously on the exercise bike. I stifled a scream as every hair on my neck stood up. Without thinking, I ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, and shoved my dresser in front of it. I huddled on my bed, dialing the cops. But by the time the police arrived, Mark was long gone. There were no signs of forced entry and nothing to conclusively link him to the incident. The officers suggested changing my locks and number and filing a restraining order, but I knew none of that would stop Mark. This man had invaded the one place I always felt safe, my home. I could never feel secure there again. Over the next few weeks, I became a shut-in, refusing to leave my apartment even to run basic errands. I let all my calls go to voicemail, which filled up with messages from Mark ranging from saccharine sweet to frighteningly enraged. He still kept asking about the bike, though I had gotten rid of it by then. I knew I needed to get away from this city and Mark for good. I quietly looked for apartments in nearby towns, eventually finding a small rental that I could afford by dipping heavily into my savings. I moved there in the dead of night, not breathing a word to anyone. Despite all my precautions, Mark still managed to find me a month later. The threatening messages resumed, demanding to know where I had gone with his exercise bike. The nightmare followed me no matter where I went. That harrowing experience taught me you can never be too wary when interacting with strangers online. Always verify identities and information before bringing someone into your life, even for something as mundane as an item sale. Listen to your instincts. If something feels amiss, don't ignore red flags, even if it seems impolite. In my case, the costs of giving someone the benefit of the doubt nearly destroyed my sense of security and privacy. I'm still struggling to recover and rebuild my life. For now, I'm just thankful to have escaped with my physical safety, if not my mental peace. But I know I'll be looking over my shoulder, worried Mark will reappear for a long time to come. I was browsing Craigslist late one night when an ad for an antique wooden chest caught my eye. The seller said it was a family heirloom they were trying to get rid of for an unbelievably cheap price of just $50. I quickly sent them a message that I'd take it. We arranged a pickup for the next morning. I borrowed my roommate's truck and drove out to the address, an old rundown farmhouse off a long dirt road about 20 minutes outside of town. An elderly man wearing dusty overalls answered the door and silently led me to the chest sitting in the corner of the dimly lit barn. He said it had been locked up in his attic for decades ever since he was a young boy and he had lost the key long ago. I loaded the heavy oak chest by myself into the back of the truck as the old man watched from the porch, not offering to help at all. As I drove back into town, I started thinking about what mysteries could be hidden inside this old chest. Buried treasure, love letters, antiques. My mind raced with possibilities. I decided that as soon as I got home, I would find a way to break open the old iron lock. When I got back to my apartment, I carried the chest upstairs to the parking lot so I could try to pick the lock without making too much noise. After an hour struggling with a paperclip, the antique lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I grabbed a hammer from my toolkit and gave it a few swift whacks until the old iron lock finally snapped open with a loud crack. Holding my breath in anticipation, I slowly lifted the heavy lid. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at inside. There was a wooden baseball bat covered in dried blood that had pooled and coagulated at the bottom. The barrel had thick streaks of deep burgundy. It had clearly been used to bludgeon something or someone. I gasped and jumped back, nearly dropping the lid. My mind started racing with panic. Why was there a bloody bat? Did the old man know of this when he stole it? Is that why he seemed eager to get rid of it? I didn't know what to do. I was freaking out about having this murder weapon. I had to get rid of it fast. I carefully wrapped the bat in plastic bags and stashed it in a duffel bag in my truck. That night, I drove out to a wooded area by the lake, dug a deep hole, and buried the bat. I kept thinking I was destroying evidence or interfering with a crime, but I just wanted it gone. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with researching the chest's history. Online, I found out the family who originally owned it decades ago had a teenage son named Tim who went missing mysteriously in the 1960s. Rumors swirled that Tim was murdered by a friend with a bat over a dispute about a girl. They never found his body or the bat. I couldn't stop thinking about that bloody bat buried in the woods. I became convinced I should tell the police what I found. But that would mean admitting I dug up evidence and hid it. After a few sleepless nights, I decided I had to do the right thing. I drove out to the burial site with a shovel to dig up the bat and turn it in. But when I got there, the ground had been disturbed. Someone had already dug it up. I started to panic even more. Who could have taken the bat? I rushed home and anxiously awaited any news reports about more remains being discovered or a break in the cold case. A week later, I finally saw a small article about Tim's family receiving an anonymous package containing a note and the long-lost probable murder weapon, a wooden baseball bat with decades-old bloodstains. I was simultaneously relieved and terrified. Someone else knew about the bat and turned it in, but who? And did they know I had buried it there? Were they watching me? Over the next month, I became paranoid and withdrawn. I barely slept, stopped going to classes, didn't hang out with friends. I was obsessed with the idea that someone out there knew my secret. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, a brick came crashing through my window. Attached was a note reading, "I know what you did." I froze in fear, peering out into the darkness, looking for any sign of who could have left the ominous message. My phone suddenly rang, making me jump. An unfamiliar voice simply stated, "Stay quiet about what you found, for your own good." Then the line went dead. I was more panicked than ever. Someone clearly wanted me to keep this buried, literally and figuratively. I didn't know what to do or who I could trust. I realized I had to disappear. That night, I hastily packed a bag, withdrew all my savings, and left town. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get far away from that farmhouse, the chest, and the bloody bat. I just hope I can finally escape this nightmare. I was browsing Craigslist one Saturday afternoon, searching for a used car that would fit my limited budget. As a college student with a part-time job, I desperately needed a reliable vehicle but didn't have much money to spend. Most of the ads I came across were either too expensive or for cars with extremely high mileage. I was starting to lose hope when an ad for a 2005 Toyota Camry caught my eye. The asking price was just $3,500, which seemed surprisingly cheap given it was only 7 years old. According to the description, it had less than 90 miles and was in great mechanical condition. This could be my chance to finally get a car of my own. I excitedly contacted the seller through the anonymous Craigslist email relay. Within an hour, I received a reply that the Camry was still available and to text a number provided for more details. The seller, a man named Martin, responded quickly to set up a meeting that same evening at his home so I could test drive the car. I plugged the address in my phone's maps app and drove across town to the location just as the sun was starting to set. It was in an older neighborhood that had seen better days, with small houses lined up on postage stamp lots. I pulled up in front of a faded blue bungalow and saw an elderly man waiting by the Camry parked in the short driveway. He introduced himself as Martin and explained the Camry had belonged to his daughter, who was away studying nursing at the state college. She had left it with him to sell locally so she could use the money for tuition and books. Under the orange glow of the streetlight, I inspected the exterior of the white Camry. The paint still held a decent shine, and there were only minor scratches and dings. The tires seemed nearly new, with plenty of tread left. Martin pointed out recent work like a new timing belt, oil change, brake job, and fresh set of shock absorbers. He said they had diligently maintained it and all scheduled maintenance was up to date. When Martin unlocked it, I sank into the driver's seat and was happy to see only 83,242 miles on the odometer. The upholstery and carpeting were clean, with no visible stains or tears. A faint pine scent hung in the air from a small green tree air freshener. I turned the key and the engine purred to life smoothly. We took it for a brief test drive around the dimly lit neighborhood streets. It handled flawlessly, the transmission shifted gears without issue, the brakes responded sharply, and the steering tightened up nicely around corners. By the time we returned to Martin's house, I was fully convinced this Camry was a perfect car for my needs and budget. We settled on $3,400. I paid in cash for my savings, and he signed over the title. I happily drove away in my new used Toyota, grinning ear to ear. For a college kid, it felt liberating finally having my own car to get around whenever I wanted. Over the next week, I excitedly showed all my friends my new ride and told them about the unbelievable deal I scored. Some were skeptical it could be so cheap, but I assured them it was legit. I had plans to install a new CD stereo, get some minor bodywork done, and freshen out the interior. But first, I wanted to thoroughly clean inside to make it spotless. One Saturday morning, I pulled the Camry into a self-serve car wash bay with my supplies, towels, vacuums, soap. As I vacuumed the empty trunk, I noticed a slit in the carpeting on the driver's side. I peeled it back to inspect underneath and saw an electrical tape package tucked up against the wheel well. My pulse quickened. What could be hidden inside? My mind raced with dark possibilities. I slowly peeled the thick black tape off and opened the package. Inside, I found a freezer bag stuffed full of white powder. I dabbed a tiny bit on my finger and tasted the bitter chemical flavor. My stomach dropped as I realized this was clearly illegal drugs of some kind, likely cocaine or meth. Someone had stashed them in this hideaway spot. It hit me that the suspiciously cheap sale price likely meant this car had a shady history I didn't know about. Panicked, I tried calling and texting Martin, but the number was disconnected. I immediately drove back to the house where I bought it, but found the place deserted with a rental sign out front. The seller had obviously used a burner phone and fake identity before disappearing without a trace. I was freaking out about what to do next. Should I go to the police and try to explain the situation, even if it meant admitting possession of a large quantity of drugs? What if whoever hid them came searching for their lost stash and tracked me down? I could be in real danger. After debating my options, I decided to quietly dispose of the bag. Late that night, I drove deep into a remote wooded area, hiked to a secluded spot, and buried the drugs under loose dirt and leaves. I then thoroughly cleaned the Camry's trunk again to remove any remaining evidence. For weeks afterwards, I was constantly paranoid the actual owners would find me or the car. I kept it parked down the street from my apartment and found myself checking the mirrors more when driving, certain I was being followed. Each random sound at night made my heart race. Finally, after 2 anxious months with no sign of trouble, I decided to just get rid of the Camry. I sold it cheap and undisclosed the full story to a buddy who needed a vehicle. While I took a big financial loss on it, I was relieved to have that car, and the terrifying uncertainty about its past gone from my life. This experience taught me to be much more cautious when buying used vehicles, as you never know their full history or what prior owners may have hidden inside. I'll never make the mistake of getting swept up in an enticingly cheap car deal again. When it seems too good to be true, it always is. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.